The NBL Blitz tips off tonight in Canberra. Now here's one question that every team needs to use the Blitz to answer ahead of the regular season. So we'll start with teams that we have seen already, because we've seen 6 teams. We'll start with the Brisbane Bullets. We only saw them once in this game here against the Cairns Taipans. And my biggest takeaway, my biggest question for them is the import trio that they have strong enough to really carry this team to at least the playoffs? It's been a big change for them. They've brought in the new coach in Stu Lash, 2 big hitting imports, but most importantly, Jalen Adams, former league MVP. And he looked okay in this game. He was struggling to shoot the ball, but dished out a bunch of assists. And Javon Freeman-Liberty, he was shooting the ball really well. He shot well over 50%, but he was brought in as a point guard and, really to be a distributor, and he didn't have any assists. And then, of course, bringing back Casey Prather, and he's getting better every year seemingly. He's looking really good. And then other than that, well, no other real big hitting ins for the Bullets. And no massive outs. I mean, the literal massive out in Rocco Zakarski, and then Josh Bannon, who had an injury interrupted season but still looked okay. He's headed down to Tassie. But they really are going to have to be led by this import trio, averaging well over 50 points a game and kind of leading in every statistical category. And while yes, it's exciting to have Sam McDaniel back after missing the entire season being hurt, but I think the big thing for them is really going to be, do this import trio. They have to be the best import trio in the league if the Bullets are going to make it to playoffs. And I feel like playoffs has to be the expectation for them. Moving on to the Cairns Taipans now, and we saw them in 3 preseason games, but they had literally less than half of their roster playing on those games. I got to call them in their game against the Phoenix, and it was literally the starting 5 was the likely 5 bench players during the regular season, and then the bench 5 was training players, development players, and guys fighting for a spot. So we can't really take a whole lot from that into the Blitz and into the regular season. So my big question for them is, what does this squad actually look like when they're together? Jack McVeigh, Rain Smith, Admiral Schofield, Ashton Hagans, Marcus Lee, we all haven't seen them take the floor for the Taipans. We saw Mawat Mag, the rookie from BYU, and he looked okay. He still looked very fresh, and it's still literally his rookie professional season. So we don't know really how they're going to look together. We saw glimpses of Rain Smith and Jack McVeigh together for the Boomers, but how do they all work together alongside Marcus Lee? Sorry, we actually did see Marcus Lee take the floor. The first thing he did was get a block and a dunk, and then attempted a 3, which is stuff that we did not get to see from him when he was with Melbourne United or when he was with the Jack Jumpers. So promising signs from that aspect. And then the promising sign of what we saw from Kyron Galloway in the preseason games. One of the things that we can take from these preseason games was how aggressive he was looking alongside Alex Higgins-Titcher, how good they were looking together. So there's promising signs, but we haven't seen all 5. We haven't seen the starting 5. We haven't seen them all together. The expectation on paper is kind of mid-table, kind of play-in, and I think that's about fair. Following on from a ridiculous Asia Cup from Jack McVeigh, and then the confidence that Rain Smith got alongside, Adam Ford returning to this team, who gives so much confidence to these youngsters. What are we going to see from them? How confident are they? How much leeway are they going to get? And I think that the Taipans are going to be, as they always are, fun to watch, but they might actually string together a bunch of wins and really cause some headaches for the top end of the ladder. Moving on to Melbourne United now, and there's 2 questions that I think need to be answered, and they do kind of go hand in hand. One is about the defense. Can they play good enough defense to kind of be able to keep up with the offense, which is what we know that they're really built on with this, spreading the floor with shooters. But I think that goes hand in hand with the question around rotations. when Jesse Edwards is on the bench, they are quite small, because in their preseason games, they had Nick Tartar playing. Nick Tartar is just a replacement player, so he can't suit up during the regular season. So that means that Fabian Krislovic or Finn Delaney probably are going to have to play that 5, but most likely Krislovic, a guy who's probably a 3 or a 4 at this level, having to play the backup 5 against some teams that have some big centers is going to be interesting to see. And then they have a whole bunch of guards. The guard rotation is really going to be tough for Dean Vickerman, and they're usually pretty guard heavy. But you've got Tyson Walker, you've got Dash Daniels, you've got Tom Wilson, Tanner Krebs is probably a 2 or a 3. You've got Milton Doyle, you've got Chris Golding, who's a 2 or a 3 as well. And then the question mark around Shea Illy, who's still not medically cleared yet to play. When and if he is back, is Shea going to come off the bench? Is Dash Daniels not going to play a whole bunch, at least at the start of the season, until Dean Vickerman is really confident in what he can do? Is Tom Wilson just going to ride at the end of the bench? So you've got a whole bunch of guys who are starter level. Is that going to ruffle feathers? Is that going to hurt ego? Is it going to, how a rotation's going to work? It's a blessing and a curse to have a star-studded lineup. Then that brings in the buy-in factor of how is everyone going to be able to handle it. Inevitably, Melbourne are going to be running a whole bunch of small ball. If Jesse Edwards is in foul trouble or anything else, if he's sitting down, then how does that match up against teams that have big centers or that like to play big or that can play, a team like an Adelaide who have 3 genuine bigs in Cheatham, Humphreys and Trez, or Perth who have Joe Luala-Chul, who's a centre who can kind of stretch the floor. How's that going to work? How are they going to be able to balance that? The South East Melbourne Phoenix now, and I got to call both of their preseason games. This one here against the Taipans, and then their game against Melbourne United, and 2 very different outcomes and results and tests for them. The real highlight and emphasis for both of these games was their defense, and that intense Josh King style of 40 minutes of pressing and not letting the opponent get comfortable at all. So the main question is, can they play that 40 minutes of intense defense at that level against teams that are better than half of a Cairns Taipans team and a Melbourne United team who have only played 1 preseason game and are still missing a couple of key pieces? Now, the main reason I say that is because their offense, it's not quite looking polished yet, and it feels like the real emphasis for them, the best offense, and I said this on the broadcast in both games, is running and gunning and playing that kind of 10 seconds or less offensive set. And that works when it works. But if you're fouling, if you're letting the opposition score and then set up their defense, then what do they look like in sets? Who's going to be that number 1 guy? You've got an aging star in Nathan Sobey who had a down year last year, and it's probably not going to be the same this year. If we're going off of preseason performance, you've got DJ Mitchell, who is absolutely lighting up the floor and knocking down shots everywhere. You've got Vrenz Blyenberg, who I'm going to make a video on because he is an absolute unicorn. Court vision out the wazoo, but he is seeming a little bit timid in creating his own shot and getting to the basket or taking shots for himself, which is something I think the Phoenix are really going to need out of him. And then we didn't see a whole lot of Owen Foxwell, who just came off of Asia Cup duties. But, where does he fit into this? Is he going to be a scorer? Is he going to be more of a facilitator? Phoenix are going to this kind of positionless basketball style. We saw Blyenberg bringing up the ball a bunch in these preseason games. So is he going to run that offense like we saw from Xavier Cooks at the Asia Cup? We saw these quick rotations in subs and kind of come off when you need a breather because you're going to be on in a couple of minutes pretty much straight after when the person who took you out needs a breather, because they're running non-stop, 40 minutes of full court pressing, things like that. We saw it work a whole bunch at the back end of last year. So now that there's been a full preseason under Josh King, he's brought in guys that play his style and that he thinks suit him better, now there's no excuses for the Phoenix. So can they run this Josh King game plan to perfection? And if they can, then they're going to be pretty good. For the Sydney Kings, my big question for them is, can this star-studded lineup that they've brought in gel and be what the Kings were meant to be in NBL 25? You know, I predict the starting lineup is going to be Kendrick Davis, Matthew Dellavedova, Jalen Galloway, based on his preseason alone, then Cooks and Suarez. Now, this lineup that they had last year, you know, all the talk was, you know, give the rings to the Kings already before the season started. And then it completely fell apart. And they, at times, looked horrible with this unbelievable offseason that Jalen Galloway had, back to full health, and then winning the MVP at the Asia Cup, along with Xavier Cooks, who played some of his best basketball in recent memory, especially playing that kind of point forward position and running the offense, which looked really good for the Boomers, alongside Tim Suarez, who is kind of a role player, but maybe not a role player, but a perfect fit in this team. Doesn't need the ball a whole lot, just kind of does what's needed. He sets screens, he catches lobs, he's got an outside shot, and he plays good enough defense, working perfectly. And in the glimpses that we've already seen with him alongside Delly, catching lobs, you know, setting screens, that pick and roll is already looking really, really good. Can they all work together without having Cooks and Galloway for a whole bunch of the preseason? Can Brian Goorjian get them all together with Andrew Bogut, who's now joined this coaching lineup? Can they all gel? Can it all work to perfection? Because if it can, if the Blitz gets them all together, and then if we see those glimpses in the early preseason, then I'll be the first one to say give the rings to the Kings. Now, last for the teams that we've already seen in preseason action, the Tasmania Jack Jumpers. Now, I already made a video reacting to the Jack Jumpers' first game of the preseason and kind of the emphasis around their defense. And that's the main point for this video as well. How are they formulating their defense when Will Magnay is not on the floor? Because they seem to be struggling, you know, from a scheme perspective without either a true center or at least a solid defensive center on the floor. So Will Magnay, I expect, is going to play a whole bunch of minutes, which he should have anyway. He really is the focal point and the anchor of this Jack Jumpers defense, because when he goes off, it's Kobe Williamson, a rookie, coming in to replace him. Now, we haven't seen a whole lot of Kobe Williamson, 203 centimeters, 24 years old. So, of course, there's going to be uncertainty and questions around him. And if he's solid, if he's a solid backup for Will Magnay, well, then this question's going to be answered and it's going to be easy. But I think for the main focus of the Blitz for the Jack Jumpers really has to be the defense, because the offense is fine. They're going to be fine. Bryce Hamilton running the show there. You know, you've got Josh Bannon, who can knock down a whole bunch of shots. You've got Ben Air in his spot minutes, who's going to be aggressive and get to his look. You've got Anthony Drimmick, similarly an aggressive player. You've got Majok Deng, who can really spark it up. You've got Nick Marshall, who can, you know, knock down any shot from anywhere. You got Tiger Campbell, who impressed in his, you know, early time with the team. He'd only been with the team for a week or so before these preseason games. So I'm not worried about the offense as much, because it's all well and good to score. If you can't stop anyone, then you're screwed. And that's been the emphasis of the Jack Jumpers since their inception. And they went away from that a bit last year, and it really cost them. Now, especially losing Sean McDonald, going down with that injury in the preseason for the Boomers. They've had to scramble. They've had to go really quick, because he was going to be their starting point guard, and he was going to be able to guard the opposition's best guard. Now they've had to go away from that, so chances are they would have had to change a fair bit of their defensive scheme. So that puts a lot of emphasis on the bigs. Now for the teams that we haven't seen in preseason games so far, and we start with the Adelaide 36ers. Now, there's a lot of information on this screen right now. This is the official NBL off-season roster tracker, and Adelaide has far and away had the most movement. Now, of course, signing Bryce Cotton was the headline of the off-season. It was the biggest story, but my big question for them going into the Blitz is around their starting five. The potential depth chart that they've got here is what I think their starting five should be. Bryce Cotton, DJ Vasiljevic, Flynn Cameron, Zylan Cheatham, Humphreys, with Montrezl Harrell coming off the bench. Now, the idea for last season for Adelaide was for Trez to come off the bench, but because of injuries and other things, he ended up starting pretty much every game he was there for. Now, the reason I think this is a necessary starting five is having Flynn Cameron as your starting three means that he can guard the opposition's best guard. And then Cotton and Vasiljevic can kind of make up who's left. Because the big question, especially with this high-octane backcourt that they've signed, is how are they going to stop the opposition? Well, the easiest way is to have Flynn Cameron come in and stop the opposition's best player at least. And then Matt Kenyon coming off the bench, Harris coming off the bench as well, and Isaac White. So all of the backups guards, along with Flynn Cameron, who can kind of play a 1-3, are all solid defenders, if not known for their defense. Having Flynn Cameron starting is the right idea. Same thing with having Trez come off the bench. He can kind of run that second unit. He can still go and get his, be a really smart and effective player, get a whole bunch of buckets when he's in form, play some solid defense as well. It's his second year. We know that second year imports have kind of had the chance to adjust to the officiating. If this all gels, if it all works, and if they can play defense, and that's the big if, then they're right up there with the Kings in terms of championship favourites. Adelaide probably are the championship favourite right now, and with good reason. We move now to the Illawarra Hawks, who have had a quiet but successful off-season. The reigning champions who, right at the end of their season, lost their superstar in Sam Froling, and that's caused a massive headache for them. But they've got some pretty good replacements in his older brother, Harry, who's back in the NBL, which is a great story. I watched him all throughout the off-season with the Melbourne Tigers, and he had a dominant year. But then they also brought in JaVale McGee, of all people. Older guy, but just a pro's pro. Isn't going to demand the ball or anything. He's going to do what any good five-man does. He's going to set screens, he's going to get rebounds, and he's going to catch lobs. Now, we're not going to see him at the Blitz, so I guess my big question for the Hawks is just, can they run it back? It's going to be interesting to see, because they didn't lose a whole lot of people, not a whole lot of key pieces. They lost Trey Kell, that's a big out for them for sure, and then they lost Lockie Ulbrich to the NBA, Darius Days, who kind of found his role at the back end of the season, and then Hyunjung Lee, who is one of my favourite players personally, a sniper off the bench, but not the biggest losses, all things being said. They've brought in Jonah Bolden, who started to find his form again. Dave O'Hickey probably running the point for them. They still have a chance to bring in someone else, an import to run that point. Probably going to bring one in. They still have an import slot that they could still fill, and are probably looking at that point guard position. Still have Tyler Harvey, who, there's talks about him being a naturalized citizen soon, so potentially 2 import spots that they could bring in. It does seem like they're probably going to hold off on getting an import unless they need one, because you have Dave O'Hickey who can run that point, especially coming off of that Asia Cup campaign where he looked so good. So my main question for them is just, can they run it back? They've had a couple of years under Coach Tatum. They've got this kind of, underdog mentality, which at times didn't really work for them last year when they were on top of the ladder for most, if not all, of the season, and ended up winning the championship, deservedly so. So Can they run it back? Can they stick together? If they get Sam Froling back, as he's posed to miss most, if not all, of the season, how does he look? How does Harry Froling look at NBL level? Looked really solid at NBL 1 level, looked like an NBL player at NBL 1 level, but how does he go? And then how fun is it going to be watching JaVale McGee, of all people, in the NBL? The New Zealand Breakers. Now, I'm going to be so honest, I have absolutely no idea what to expect from the Breakers this season. They've had a really quiet off-season, just kind of gone about things quietly under the radar, at least from my perspective, because, well, I'm in a different country, I'm in Australia. They've brought back a whole bunch of good local talent. They've brought in Ruben Tarangi, Rob Lowe, Isaiah Leafa, all from other NBL teams who have gone back home. And then they've brought in a couple of youngsters. They brought in Taylor Britt, who NBL players have probably heard of because they've been around a little bit. They brought in Liam Judd, who's an up-and-coming superstar. And then they've brought in some really interesting imports. Isaiah Brockington and Rob Barker. So some interesting guys that they've brought in. They haven't lost anything crazy. You know, Pino and Mitch McCarron retiring. Taco Fall not returning. I think that is a very good decision. Losing Freddie Gillespie hurts a little bit. Matt Mooney was a little bit up and down. So my big question for the Breakers is just, what are we expecting for them? Is ignorance bliss? Because they've had a pretty quiet off-season. They've had the rebranding to their old branding. After, you know, they've had their front office changes and things like that. They brought back a whole bunch of local talent. So they're doing good things. I just don't really know what to expect from them on the floor. So the Blitz is going to be a good chance to kind of figure out what the expectation for them should and is going to be. And finally, the Perth Wildcats. Oh boy, the Perth Wildcats. And they have had a tumultuous off-season, to say the least. My question for them is, who the hell is the starting point guard? Are they bringing in an import? Are they going to rely on Sunday Detch and Elijah Pepper and Ben Henschel to kind of be that backcourt for them? Look, losing Bryce Cotton is always going to be, you know, a massive loss. It's always going to be impossible to replace one of, if not the best imports, one of, if not the best players in NBL history. And Mark Arena has been vocal on Twitter and has been responding to fans about talking about patience, about, you know, they've had their rebranding, their logo change, the Wildcat Army, whatever the new, you know, name of everything is. And that's all well and good, but it seems like he's trying to divert the attention away from the point guard position, the point guard situation. Are they waiting to see how NBA contracts land and try and grab someone who was right on the fringe of the NBA? You know, they made a nice splash by signing Joe Labalachul Jr. That's a massive get. He's going to be the focal point of this team. But when you don't have a starting point guard, or you're still open to a starting point guard position, then what's the situation? Elijah Pepper had an unbelievable off-season in the NBL 1 West, was breaking records constantly, but we've seen him at NBL level and it's not the same. And of course it's not going to be the same. He's not going to go out and score 50 4 weeks in a row in the NBL. Bryce Cotton might. So are they bringing in another import? They should be. I'm assuming that they will. They still have an import slot open. And there's not a whole lot of, you know, superstar local point guards floating around. So clearly they're not going to have that at the Blitz. So is this a kind of audition for Elijah Pepper, for Sunday Detch, for Ben Henschel, to see one of them is going to have that starting role, at least at the start of the season? But if that's what they're going to go with, what are they holding on to that import slot for? So that was the main question I have for every team heading into the NBL Blitz. I can't wait to be proven wrong, as I always am. Let me know what questions you have about your team. Leave them in the comments below. Also, check out my Twitch. I'll be doing watch-alongs of all the NBL games during the 25-26 season, except for the ones that I'll be commentating, and that should be fun.